Well, welcome. We are now at Genesis chapter 6, and we will go fast as usual. You have the flood account, of course, here in Genesis. Now, concerning the Nephilim, the heroes of old, men of renown, who are they? You know, Hollywood has made a lot of movies on this. There are basically, within the realm of Christian theology, three main views as to the Nephilim's identity. One, they are the sons of Seth, who intermingled with the offspring of Cain. Number two, they are simply mighty men of renown. They are, in short, giant men. Or three, they are fallen angels. These left, quote-unquote, their proper domain, which is from Jude 6, to interbreed with the daughters of men, and in turn produced a freakish superior race, half demonic and half human. View 1 and view 2 avoids the problem, of course, of angels being bodiless. And you can find that in Hebrews chapter 1, verse 14. Moreover, they are sexless beings. You can see that in Matthew chapter 22, verse 30. View 3 explains it all well, setting aside the problems with angels just mentioned. So you can pick your choice on that. I think we can't be too dogmatic. And if you take view 3, that they are fallen angels, you have to answer the problem of how they can reproduce being sexless beings. If it was a case of demonic possession, well, still, how could an angel or fallen angel or demon possess a body and in turn make the DNA work, so to speak, as in normal intercourse? To produce a demonic sperm, I don't think that is even close to possible. But I'm not going to be dogmatic. There are problems with all three views, and we don't have to take a position. Your position could be non-position in that, look, here are the three main views, and we'll go from there. Anyway, why was God unsatisfied? In Genesis 1:32, God said all was good, and he seemed very satisfied. Yet in Genesis 6:6, he's deeply grieved with his creation, in particular, all the wickedness and the existence, of course, of the Nephilim. So one take here is God didn't just destroy the world in the flood, or the known world, saving Noah and his family, just because of wickedness. He was also outraged at the existence of this Nephilim race, whoever they were, or ethnic group, if you will. If it was half demonic and half human, it would be a different race. It wouldn't just be a human race. So, having said that, Genesis 1 and 6 speak of humanity at different times under completely different conditions. In the Garden of Eden, they existed in paradise, in a paradise garden, which is pre-fall, before the fall. In Genesis 6, we're dealing with humanity after the fall, or quote-unquote post-fall. So despite this evil generation, God found favor with Noah. And of course, Genesis 6, verses 9 through 13, you have the account of Noah, that he was righteous and blameless among the people. Slide 130, Noah listened and obeyed and did exactly what God told him to do. Build a floating zoo, so to speak. The ark is obviously a ship, but noteworthy is the fact that the ark is only used in one other passage, and that's in Exodus chapter 2. The ark refers to the basket that Moses was placed in. Notice that Noah discovers God's divine favor. As opposed to earning or winning a favor, he discovers God's divine favor. He didn't earn it. In verse 7, God speaks to himself about destroying the earth. In verse 13, God shares that destruction with Noah, and we see the same thing when God explains to Abraham that he will destroy Sodom, which you have in chapter 18. Moving on to slide 131, you have verses 14 and 18, or through 18 in Genesis 6. You can read that on your own. So God gives Noah a long speech with specific directions. His neighbors think he's crazy in building this ship or this giant ark. In modern dimensions, this boat would be roughly 450 feet long, 75 feet wide, and 45 feet tall. Given those measurements and its materials used, this boat would be able to carry some 43,000 tons that could be spread out over some 1.4 million cubic feet. Therefore, there's no wonder that he could fit so many animals. Some have calculated that the total deck space would be about 95,700 square feet. That is huge. On slide 133, you have the verses in Genesis 6, 19 through 22. I'm going to move on to the notes. Slide 134, he was asked to take one male and female from every clean species. Clean species you can read about in Deuteronomy chapter 14, verses 3 through 21. Clean versus unclean. Is there a suggestion that there were two floods based on one pair or 7 pairs? In Genesis 6, 19 through 20, and chapter 7, 15 through 16, we see the general information. Bring about pairs of animals. Then in Genesis 7:2, we see specific information. In other words, bring aboard 7 pairs. No contradiction there. For more on that, study slide 134. God not only saved the clean species, but also ensured that Noah and his family had enough food, including enough food to tend for the animals that were aboard this great, massive ship. Is it reasonable to believe in the flood, apart from special revelation? I think so, for sure. Before we get into archaeological slides and so forth, please look at slide 135, where he was asked to take one male and female from every clean species. Study that hard. And then move on to 136, where we have more ancient flood accounts mentioned in other records. For example, you have the Gilgamesh epic, slide 136, and the Nineveh discovery. Remember, Jonah was sent to Nineveh, which was the capital of the Assyrian Empire. On the Gilgamesh epic, you see on tablet 11 a similar story as seen in Genesis chapter 6 through 9. In the Nineveh discovery, the Nineveh clay tablets are the best known copies or inscriptions baked on clay tablets, setting aside the Torah of Moses, where you have flood accounts. You know, here in California, we have ancient caves. I'm going to say older caves where Indians have actually etched into the stone giant boats with animals filling it and so forth. Kind of sophomoric graffiti, if you will. But it tells us that the flood account story was spread throughout the world, not just in the Gilgamesh epic, Nineveh discovery, but even here in California. Tablet 11 of the Gilgamesh epic tells a story of the wrath of the gods, plural, bringing about the great flood. In the biblical account, of course, is Yahweh, God, monotheistic God that's doing this. Number 2, it also mentions a hero who is to build a ship to survive the flood. And of course, biblically, that would be Noah. Number 3, for the hero to bring along animals, to use the birds, to see if the water receded. Biblical account, of course, Noah did just that. On slide 137, you have a picture from, well, it dates this tablet to 2700 BC, long time ago. There you have a picture of tablet 11. And moving on, do other flood accounts exist? Well, I don't know if you've read much on biblical archaeology or geology, but the geological record implies a universal flood. You know, you can look in Siberia. In Siberia, they found frozen mammoths in ice. And the Siberians have taken out and de-thawed these mammoths and cut open their stomachs. Guess what they found? Fresh vegetation, which indicates a sudden death. Some of these animals are buried in frozen swimming positions and then frozen with their spines broken backwards. And they're buried with just layers of mud, layers of water that looks like it was gushing at 100 miles an hour, just very, very fast, frozen instantaneously. The food that they had eaten, these mammoths in Siberia, didn't even have enough time to digest. So what does that prove? It proves sudden death. In Grand Canyon, when you take a geology class, they'll tell you, well, look at the tables here. This is such and such era. Here is another layer which came later, etc., etc. And they try to prove through evolution that the different layers of strata is somehow proof, not for a universal flood, but for just different layers of strata equaling billions and billions of years old. My wife, she grew up near Mount, what was it, in Washington? Major volcanic eruption happened up north, and divers from ICR, the Institute for Creation Research, Henry Morris, Dwayne Gish, and these fellas, they send divers up there. And within a very short amount of time, after this volcano had stopped and things were dried out, the layers of strata that they observed were close to that of Grand Canyon. Yet it happened within weeks, not billions of years. So you might want to look at a few books. A great book by Dwayne Gish. Dr. Dwayne Gish is The Fossils Say No. And I watched him debate Dr. Shermer at UCLA actually it was about a decade or 15 years ago, and he won hands down. But nonetheless, there are other flood accounts worldwide that depict this. Now, on slide 139, you have an ancient Indian flood account. The message there is translated to show a story of a family on a large ship with animals saved from destruction. And some argue that this might be the art of an ancient descendant of Noah, a colonizing immigrant, if you will. Emigrant, that is, not immigrant, emigrant. You have other pictures of the flood. You can click on 141. There's a 60-minute video on dinosaur tissue and so forth. I'm going to continue to scroll on past these arc pictures to Gilgamesh, the Babylonian king on slide 150. The fifth king of Uruk, which would be Babylonia, the Babylonian period, which would be 4,000 up to about 3,100 BC. 4,000 BC to 3,100 BC before Christ. That's the early dynastic second period, which takes us up to 2,700 BC. Here is seen a real historical figure who believed in the flood. The Babylonian king. He believed in the flood. The Gilgamesh epic, again depicting a flood, is a real historical artifact. It appears to have been mainstream belief in the early times of humanity. Why the judgment of a flood? People wonder. First of all, God can't learn. You got to understand that. So when you read these terms like God was disappointed, for example, or his heart was grieved, he didn't have a heart. He's not grieved. He doesn't learn. It's as if you really believe that God was grieved in our English language, that would mean that God could learn. I'm going to create the world and, oh my goodness, I'm so disappointed. Look at what happened. Well, he can't be surprised. So he doesn't learn. So why the judgment of a flood? Some hold that the Nephilim account, if angelic, in Genesis 6:4, was a travesty and an awful sin. Even if this referred to the sons of Seth and not fallen angels, the context of the following verse is, quote-unquote, wickedness. The Lord saw how great man's wickedness were on the earth, and you have that in 6 verse 5, and that every inclination of the thoughts of his heart was evil continually or all the time. So far in our study, Adam and Eve rebelled, and that's recorded in the fall of Genesis 3:6. You have Lucifer's sin, that's recorded. That's the first angelic revolt. You have that in Isaiah 14. Then Cain kills his brother Abel in Genesis 4, verse 8. God's charge to Noah in building a massive ship is immediately preceded by the Nephilim story in Genesis 6, 1 through 4. In verse 5, right after the Nephilim story, God saw the wickedness, judgment awaits, time to build a ship, I'm going to save you and destroy the rest of them. Now, what about the argument? Could it have been a local flood or global flood? Find Christian thinkers on both sides. If it was a local flood, well, it seems that God wouldn't have to tell Noah to build a ship, right? Just go walk over there 1,000 feet or 1,000 yards or walk. Now, it took Noah 120 some years to build that ship. You know how far you can walk for 120 years? You walk a long ways. So if it was just a particular spot in the Middle East or in the Near East, God could have just told Noah and his family, split, head over there, and wait. I'm going to flood just this particular area. So I go with the idea that it's a global flood. In any event, on slide 152, some critics claim that it was a local flood. If so, then why did Noah need a ship? He could have just walked to another spot. Number two, if a local flood, why did God promise never to wipe out, quote unquote, the earth again? The earth again, not just this particular region. Number three, maybe God did not destroy all or everything while saving Noah. Well, then you have a problem, because he says here in chapter 8 of Genesis, verse 21, the latter part of the verse, that, and never again will I destroy all living creatures. And of course, that was a covenant that he made in Genesis 9, verse 8. Moving on, we have much extra biblical accounts of a flood, like I mentioned before. A couple more factors about the geological record. Worldwide, we see that the earth of the crust consists of heavy amounts of what's called sedimentary rock. This sedimentary rock is sometimes miles deep. These various layers consist of sand, various soils and materials, most of which has been laid down by water. Very interesting. This means that these materials were once soft, like mud. Now they've hardened like stone, like limestone arrives from, say, chalk. And by the way, in Israel, a lot of the old buildings, even new hotels, are made of limestone. Embedded in these sedimentary layers are marine animals and fossilized plants, billions of dead things. You know, years ago I was up in Cajamarca, which is the Andes in Peru, and I purchased sea fossils at the top of the Andes. Sea fossils. How did they get there? How did they get all the way up there? Well, it seems to have been flooded, and as a result, we have old ancient marine animals. I have them here at my office. In fact, I think, give me 2 seconds, I'll show you one. I don't know if you can see this very well, but this is a fossilized rock. I'm going to hold it closer to the camera, and you're going to see what looks like old snails. And there's at least 6 or 7 in here. This is from the Andes in Peru. How did these sea fossils make their way all the way up to the Andes? Well, I go with the idea that they were the result of a massive worldwide flood, yes, that made its way all the way to Peru in South America. Okay, moving through some pictures of Mount Ararat, where I believe the ark came to rest. My friend and former professor of Old Testament studies and the Dead Sea Scrolls, Dr. Randall Price, he has been one of the, well, I'm going to say, just at the forefront of discovering Noah's Ark. I asked to go with him, maybe to guard a bulldozer, but there are pirates in this desert, and of course, one murder was committed, one of his guys were lost, and I decided not to go. Having said that, They've done a lot of testing there. And look up Dr. Randall Price. I'm not talking about the people in the Asian continent that have just lied about Noah's Ark. Look up Dr. Randall Price. He teaches over at Liberty University in Virginia, and he's at the forefront of trying to discover, or maybe they have discovered it. If he did discover Noah's Ark on Mount Ararat, he will be the most famous archaeologist of our time. Not that he's an archaeologist. He's an Old Testament professor. But nonetheless, good guy. All right, slide 159, the Sumerian king list. On the left column, you see that the Sumerians, roughly around 2100 BC, established the first civilization known in the biblical world. Clay tablets dating over 4,000 years ago, containing a list of kings, were discovered in the ruins of ancient Mesopotamia. These ruling kings were divided into two groups. I'll tell you later why that's important. Number one, kings ruling prior to the flood. Number two, kings ruling after the flood. Interestingly, like I mentioned before, the lifespan of these ruling kings differed prior to the flood from kings ruling following the flood. Just like you see the ancestry before Noah's time, Methuselah, 969 years, they lived a long, long time, even Adam. But right after the flood, the years start to drop. You see the same exact thing in the Sumerian king list. So in the Genesis flood account, we notice man's year span dropping following the flood. We see the same in the Sumerian king's time. And that's very, very interesting because you have the division there, pre-flood and post-flood. The king's list reads, quote, this has been translated, after the flood had swept over the earth, not a local flood, over the earth, and when kingship was lowered again from heaven. This confirms Genesis 7 and 8. Moving on to the next slide, you can see the Sumerian king list, a picture of it on slide 160. You have the ruling kings of the list in the next slide. The map of the king's list on slide 163. And then now we are at Genesis 7. Notes is on 167. Noah was a righteous man, setting aside the fact that he got drunk. Right? He built a vineyard after the water receded, and then, of course, he exited the ship, and you know the whole account there. Interestingly, he was the only righteous man during that time. The water resides, all of humanity is wiped out, except for his family. What does he do? Build a vineyard, then he gets drunk. Go figure. Thousands of years later, we read that Noah was a preacher of righteousness. We see that in 2 Peter 2:5. I didn't say he lived for thousands of years. We read in 2 Peter 2 verse 5 that Noah was a preacher of righteousness. Quote, for if God did not spare angels when they sinned, but sent them to hell, putting them in gloomy dungeons to be held for judgment. Verse 5, if he did not spare the ancient world when he brought the flood on its ungodly people, but protected Noah, a preacher of righteousness, and then, of course, 7 others. Again, 7 of every kind. What does that mean? 7 represents completeness. It took the Lord, he created the world in 6 days, and on the 7th he rested, which serves as an example for us that we ought to relax and take the 7th day off. So the number 7 represents completeness. Notice also following the heavy outpour of rain in verse 11, we get 2 additional sources of water, not just coming down. Waters from the floodgates of heaven and also from the springs of the great deep. Might have been volcanoes, who knows. But there were gushing water coming from above and the fountains of the deep, springs of the deep, thrusting upward. While we have no direct reference concerning the character of Noah's wife, we do know his sons and his daughter-in-laws. It is generally agreed upon that they were saved. It's interesting also that God at first commands them to enter the ship, but who closes the door? Noah didn't shut the door from the inside. God himself shuts the door. The shift from God, the verbiage God, to Lord suggests that the Lord is the protector of the ark. Slide 166, you have Genesis 7, 11 through 24. What are some of the notes there? Verse 13 through 16. We see the action described inside the ship, while verses 17 through 25 focuses on the exterior, what's going on outside of the ark. To be outside of the ark is almost like being outside of the Garden of Eden. Inside the ark, they are saved or safe, if you will, while all outside of the ark are doomed and headed for utter annihilation. In verse 24, you have reference to 150 days, which includes the 40 days plus the length of time before the flood waters began to recede. This is confirmed in Genesis 8:4, where it reads that the ark rested on Ararat. And Mount Ararat is in modern-day Turkey. Some 5 months later, it came to rest there. This time frame represents 5 months and 30 days. In chapter 8, everything changes, quote unquote, and God remembered Noah. Now, these are human characteristics attributed to God. God doesn't forget, and he certainly doesn't remember. Either he's omniscient or he's not. So we have to be careful with this. It's not like God remembered, oh dear, Noah's still in the boat. What should I do? So these are human characteristics attributed to God, and that's where language breaks down. Genesis 8, you have on slide 168, some of the notes there are in Genesis 170. In the Old Testament, the word remembered is used 73 times. Notice that God did not remember Noah's righteousness or character, but he remembered Noah himself. Thus, in remembering Noah, whatever that means, again, it's not like he's learning, God sent a wind over the earth. Some translate the word wind here as spirit, which I suppose makes the story even more vivid. Interestingly, in Genesis 1, remember the Spirit of God hovered over the face of the water. Contrary to pagan descriptions of how the waters dried up, for example, by the sun has nothing to do with the drying up of the waters. The wind or the Spirit that God sends is what's drying it up and doing the work. Then Noah sends out a raven, 2 doves, 2 times. It's interesting how God told Noah how to build the ark and when the rain would begin. He's in control of everything here. But God is silent in disclosing when the ground is dry. It's believed that the raven did not return because it was probably feasting on corpses, resting on mountaintops. But the dove, in being a valley bird, simply he returns because doves would only eat what grows in lower areas, whereas the ravens could feast on old carcasses. Whatever one considers low at this point of the receding water is most likely uneatable dry rot. So the dove returns back to the ship. Most important, in verses 13 and 14, there are 2 different Hebrew words for the word dry used in these verses. In verse 13, it means free of moisture in the Hebrew, while verse 14 means complete absence of water. Then God speaks twice, first to Noah and then to himself. While these speeches occur, Noah and his clan exit the ark. They exit the ark, and that's it. We're done. That's where it ends. Genesis 9, 1 through 7, you have on slide 172. What are some of the notes there? Well, the specific information that God provided Noah is explained more in detail in chapter 8. In 9:7, he says here, and you, be fruitful and multiply. Teem on the earth and multiply in it. Tells us that Noah is a sort of second Adam. In this sense, Noah is a type of Adam in that, number one, he's responsible for procreation, post-flood that is, and secondly, in that Noah is the head of his family, the only family, just like Adam and his original family. In the book of Romans, Jesus is referred to as the last Adam, but not due to any procreation, but rather in the sense that he came to rescue sinful man in a fallen world, which the first Adam brought about. All right, on slide 174, you have post-flood, a different world. In the pre-flood world, Adam tended the animals. In the post-flood, man is killing the animals for food, and meat is then added to his diet. Moving on to slide 176, you have a unilateral covenant introduced. The obligation of this covenant is not on man, but rather rests fully on God. Quote, "This is the sign of the covenant that I, the Lord, I have established between me and all flesh that is on the earth." God is literally binding himself in that he promises never to flood the entire earth again. The sign is, of course, the rainbow that we see to the present day. Most interestingly, the Hebrew word for rainbow is the same as that used of a weapon or a bow and arrow. There is no difference whatsoever. From this, we might be able to consider a sort of grace introduced to the world following God's militancy in bringing about the flood. As one, Victor Hamilton puts it, quote, "The bow ceases to function as a sign of God's militancy as a bow and begins to function as a sign of God's grace," unquote. Moreover, the rainbow is a sign that I, God, will remember. Thus, for God's benefit, since he is doing he's doing all the remembering here. In all, the creation account began with God seeing all the evil. But following the flood, God moves from seeing to remembering Noah and humanity following him. Then you have Genesis 9:18 through 29 on slide 177. Some brief notes there. From Noah's sons, the earth was repopulated. Concerning our first parents, Adam and Eve, regardless of one's worldview, whether it be theism or macroevolution, humanity has a first parent. I mentioned that in our last lecture. The same is true as we believe. There was a global flood. Someone had to repopulate the earth, no matter what. Why is this so hard for the skeptic to believe? 1, his worldview allows for no God. 2, evolution is the only game in town to support his philosophy. All right, we will pick it up in our next session on slide 179, and you'll be getting that tomorrow. Talk to you soon. Lord bless.